there and welcome to the Heritage Homestead. Today we're going to be talking about antique dolls. Sometimes I'm afraid that our students get the idea, maybe from reading the Little House books or other books of the time, that the only dolls that little girls in the 19th century had were rag dolls or maybe dolls that were made at home like corncob dolls. But nothing could be further from the truth. Actually, there were a number of different dolls in the 19th century. We're going to look at some of the earliest ones first, dolls made of composition or paper mache, and then wax and wood, and then we'll go on to look at some of the china and bisques. Now, dolls are usually identified by the material of which the head is made. A china doll, for instance, can have a china head but a cloth body. And the same is true of a doll we call a bisque doll can have a bisque head and a composition body. So the dolls are known by the material the head is made of. Some of the earliest 19th century dolls that we see are made of a paper mache or composition substance, and they're called milliner's models. This is an 1830s example. You can see the high bun on the head of this doll, and they tended to look like adult women. And we can date these dolls by their hairstyles. This is a slightly later example, possibly late 1830s into the 1840s. These were popular dolls for little girls. Wax dolls ranged from extremely beautiful, high-quality English wax to some pretty horrific wax over compositions. This is a late example of a wax doll. Wax dolls were fairly cheap, so many children could afford them. She's a little wax over. I think she has a relatively pleasant expression on her face. In many cases, the wax has cracked on these dolls. They are fairly sturdy, though. Unless you get them near the heater in the direct sunlight, they do fairly well. I've always been concerned about investing too much in wax dolls because of the heat here, but they seem to do okay as long as they're given some reasonable care. The penny wooden style lasted for a long time. In fact, this is probably a 20th century example. It's fairly crudely made, but these dolls were popular from the early 19th century, as I said, on into the 20th century. They were mass-produced in Germany, and many little girls enjoyed playing with them. Even Queen Victoria had a family of little penny wooden dolls that were smaller than this that she and her governess dressed. This is a little Schoenhut wooden doll. Wooden dolls had been around. Many of them were extremely inexpensive, the so-called penny woodens. But the Schoenhuts were made here in America, and they have a pretty complicated system of springs that allows the doll to be posed in many different ways. She's not wearing her original wig, and it's kind of a mess, but you can get an idea of what the Schoenhuts were like. And of course, Schoenhut's also known for their extensive collection of toy animals. Now, wood and wax dolls were still being made even into the late 19th century, even into the 20th century. They were very common. Probably the most iconic 19th century dolls, however, were the china heads and the bisques. China dolls are glazed. They're shiny with a very white skin. Most have painted eyes and molded and painted hair. The hair can be either black or blonde. And dolls with unusual hairstyles tend to be more valuable. The earliest china heads, those from the 1840s and 50s, had very smooth hairstyles or hairstyles with long spaniel curls. And there are many different types of these heads. The hairstyles and the dolls have different names, and once again they help us to roughly date the doll. And again, these earliest chinas tend to be quite expensive, and they're heavily collected. After the covered wagon style and the spaniel curls came the so-called highbrow china heads. If you look at these, you can see that the hair is rather high off the top of the forehead. Again, you can see this in these examples. You can compare the highbrow china with the little later doll that's in the back left. These the china heads from the 1880s into the 20th century have the lowbrow hairstyle, where the hair is much lower on the forehead. And it's not uncommon to find these dolls with molded collars, bows, jewelry, and even names on their shoulder plates. This is not uncommon at all. A Parian doll is basically an unglazed china. Parians still had the very white skin tone, but without the glossy finish. And some of them had very, very elaborate hairstyles. They're highly collected today. It was the bisque dolls, however, that were really the culmination of the doll maker's art in the 19th century. Bisque is unglazed, like Parian. It has a matte finish. It's not shiny, but it's flesh-colored. And the color can range from very pale to very dark, just depending on what the doll maker wanted. The first bisque dolls tended to be fashion or lady style dolls. This is a French doll probably from the 1870s. The lady dolls started in the 1860s, really. Some of them were adult women and some of them were teenagers. At first, the porcelain heads might be made in Germany, but the doll itself was often finished and dressed in France. And today these are often called French fashion dolls because of this. Various magazines, including Poupée Modèle, published patterns for these dolls' clothes. These dolls were like a 19th century Barbie. Barbie's really nothing new. The difference being that these dolls made Barbie look like a pauper. They had real jewelry made of gold and silver. They had all kinds of little accessories like opera glasses and fans. Along with the dolls that were dressed as adult women, there were also some dolls who were dressed more like teenagers in calf-length skirts rather than the long skirts of a mature woman. This is a little German doll. You can see she has a bisque shoulder plate and a kid body. The body is not in great shape, but it's still fairly strong. You can see the toes here. You can see the fingers on her hands. She would have been a very nice doll for her time. She doesn't sleep. She has very nice eyes. Paperweight eyes. When viewed from the side, you can see the bulge there of the glass, and that's what gives these type of eyes their depth. And once again, a doll with a closed mouth is sometimes more valuable and rarer than the same type of doll with an open mouth, because children like the open mouths. They thought that was something unusual. These lady and teenager dolls were intended to help a girl role play being an adult woman. In the next illustration, which is from the magazine Harper's Bazaar, you can see the fashion dolls there on the left. You can also see there is a baby doll in this picture. Baby dolls were not as common at that time, but in the lower right-hand corner, you can see a child doll, what's called a baby, and that's where things were headed. After the fashion dolls came the time of the bisque child dolls, or babes. During the 1880s, lady dolls were replaced by these babes. Some babes, especially at first, had leather bodies, but later the more expensive child dolls had jointed bodies made of a hard substance called composition. The two main countries making the bisque baby dolls were France and Germany. The French dolls tended to be more expensive and more elaborately dressed. Some of them were even sculpted by professional sculptors. This is a French jumeau doll, and she's wearing a silk dress. She would have been owned by a very wealthy little girl. Her dress is very, very detailed. It's trimmed with handmade tatting, and I'm sure in the other picture you might have seen her large bonnet. Some people buy dolls, especially some of the French dolls, as investment items. It's not uncommon to find a Bru, which is another French maker, that costs tens of thousands of dollars. However, the most expensive French baby doll ever sold as of 2014 was an Albert Mark, and it sold for over $200,000. The little German bisque dolls, though, are still very charming. The German companies focused on quantity. It was mass production on a large scale, and they exported huge numbers of dolls to the U.S. They wore much simpler clothing in general than did the French dolls. Even medium-sized German-made dolls like these were affordable for many middle-class families. Some were very cheap. This actually belonged to my great-grandmother, and her father, my great-great-grandfather, bought this doll around 1915 for 25 cents. Some of the German dolls, however, rivaled the French dolls in terms of beauty and quality. Some were very well made, and some are highly collectible. They ranged in size from very, very small to life size. This is a reproduction of a life-size German doll, and it can even wear children's clothing of about maybe a 2-year-old, 2 to 3-year-old. Dolls with sleeping eyes and open mouths and teeth were preferred. They were heavily made because that's what all the little girls wanted. Lots of doll accessories were available. This is a wash tub set with a wringer. Of course, clothes were available even through Sears and Roebuck. This is a little tin kitchen from the 1880s. It's like a room out of a little miniature dollhouse. It has a little stove and even a working water cooler. Around the turn of the 20th century, between the 19th and the 20th century, baby dolls, true baby dolls, became more popular. Several companies made baby dolls. The $1 Million Baby Doll and various other look-alikes. Now I want to point out an interesting type of a doll. This is a little toy for babies or small children, and it's a doll head basically on a stick, and you spin it and it is like a little music box. Now these early baby dolls, of course, were bisque. They have the bisque heads, and then later they were made of composition, which is like a sawdust type material pressed into a mold. They're not quite as breakable, but if wet, they will flake and crack. There are a number of metal-headed dolls, Minerva being the most common name that you hear. Not particularly attractive dolls all the time, and the paint has often worn off, but I'm sure they were more substantial, especially for small children, than the bisque or china heads. Little awl bisques are a lot of fun, and here are some of the little awl bisques in the tin kitchen. This is a little 1880s tin kitchen with a stove and pots and even a little working water cooler over here. But here's a couple of little awl bisques, and the little girl doesn't have her wig on, so you can see that her head is open just like a larger bisque doll would be. And here's a little boy. Their clothes are new. I crocheted the clothes, but these are some little awl bisques, probably from the turn of the century. They were common, inexpensive little dolls that almost any little girl could have had. Again, awl bisques were very common. Now these two examples are not as jointed. The one on the left has jointed arms, but the legs are solid and they don't move. And again, I need to be making some wigs. The little girl on the right is what's called a frozen Charlotte. She's a little china doll with no joints. She's one solid piece. Sometimes these were called bathing dolls. They were just inexpensive little dolls children could have and crochet or knit little clothes for. There were little boys. Sometimes they're called frozen Charlies. And again, the little girls are often called frozen Charlottes. Let's look at some of the different body styles on these dolls. This is a leather body. It's very deteriorated. This example, you can see how the leather has deteriorated around the joints. This would have been a lower to mid-range body. The lowest grade was of cloth. And again, you can see a little bit of the body. Also notice that the body is out of proportion, which we see on some of the lower priced dolls. Now, among the composition bodied dolls, there are some very simple examples, little 5-piece bodies, such as this one. And you may want to take this time to look in the doll's head. The tops of the heads were cut off, not only to make it easier to put the eyes in, but also possibly also to reduce weight. Now on our larger bisque dolls, this is the more complicated body, the more complicated ball jointed body, and French dolls and German dolls had different types of bodies, but you can see how this body could be articulated in different ways. It's joined together with elastic strings inside, and elastic goes up into the head as well. And when it's properly strung, the doll can assume many different postures. It could pray, it could look like it was sitting, it could stand. Finally, let's talk about makers and marks. If you want to know more about a doll, you usually need to know who made it or the mold number. And this is fairly easy to find. If you look on the back of a doll's head or shoulder plate, you can often find the maker's mark or size number. On some dolls, however, all you'll see is Germany or some other country of origin, or either nothing at all. Here is an example of one very easy one, Armand Marseille, who actually, even though it sounds French, he was a German doll maker with the mold number 390. and then the size number 11. And that's often what you'll see on the back of a doll's head, something similar to that. In this program, we've gone over just a few of the many types of dolls. If you're interested, there are books and sites on the internet where you can learn more about antique and vintage dolls and see many photos of dolls, of course, looking on eBay or antique sites such as Ruby Lane. You can see the different types of dolls that are available for sale and learn more about them. God bless you, and we hope to see you again here at the Heritage Homeplace.